Okay, Shalom Alechem, Erev Tov, good evening. Welcome back to the Shiviti Midrash in New York. Before we start, I just wanted to say that I know that we have members from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from everywhere in between. We also have members from Hawaii, especially Maui, and I just wanted to say that our thoughts and prayers are with all of the people, not just Am Yisrael, but all of the people that are there, who need our tefillot, who need our help. Hashem should bless them with comfort and only good news. We continue where we left off last week, and I asked some of you to research for me about the French Sanhedrin. Did anyone get a chance to do that? Yes, okay. I'm actually going to wait to talk about the Sanhedrin of Paris just for a little bit, but I want to know, and don't be shy, but by a raise of hands or just maybe you can nod at me, how many of you had a chance to begin reading the book In the Shadow of History that I sent out as a PDF?
I did.
Okay. Aliza, you said you're going to keep your thoughts to yourself tonight, huh?
Yes.
It's a hard book, and I'll tell you the truth that if you are looking to get into the reading of Rabbi Faur's books, the book In the Shadow of History, I don't want to use a word like secular. That's not a word I want to use. It's the least hands-on Torah book, in my opinion, perhaps, that Rabbi Faur wrote. And so, if history interests you, if especially this topic of Jews, conversos, the Inquisition, the history of Jews that came from Spain, if that interests you, this is a very important book. Before we went anywhere, and before we even begin looking at this book, Rabbi Faur's whole thesis in general as it relates to the Christian world is that the Christian world gave us the gift of the persecution of the other. Whoever is different than me is a problem. And because you're different than me, and I don't like people who are different than me, and I must be better than you because you are different than me, then I have all freedom and all right to persecute you and destroy your life. It could be as simple as murder and killing, or literal persecution and torture and torment, all of which we received as a gift of love from Christians throughout the ages of all denominations and all backgrounds, but particularly that of the Catholic Church. In Judaism, and if you listen to the shiur that I posted about the Jewish art of war, our Chachamim never had religious enemies. We had political enemies for sure, like everyone has political enemies. You're at war, there's a country that's trying to kill you. That's a war, what can you do? But in terms of religion, in terms of persecution of other people because they are different than us, our Chachamim proposed a radically different idea. And that was the adoption, dynamically, of other cultures, nations, religions, countries, thoughts, ideas, music, art, and using them to teach HaKadosh Baruch Hu's messages to the world. And therefore, not only do we not persecute the other, but sometimes really, really admire the other. I'm thinking of that moment in the Talmud, where our Chachamim are teaching their students, and they tell their students, the sages of Greece, they're correct and we were mistaken. In which reality do we record that our Chachamim thought that the other was correct and that they were mistaken? But that exists in a world, in a culture in which we don't persecute others for being different from us. If you wish to really see the extent of Christian love to humanity, there's no better place than actually exploring what Christians did here in the United States of America before it was the United States of America, to the local populations that lived here. If I could read to you, I didn't attach the introduction to the book in the PDF, but if you go to the Google Classroom, I attached the whole entire book as a PDF in one of the sections there. If you look for it, you'll find it. I want to read you some numbers. Rabbi Faur says a basic concern of this book is the position of the other in Western tradition. At once, the other is the target of persecution. Anti-Semitism or racism are mere semiological indices designed to identify the other. Maybe I read that word wrong. It could be the carrier of some exotic disease like leprosy, different looks or mannerisms, or someone holding a distinctive set of values. Na raiti gam zakanti. I'm not so old, but I was once young. And in all those years, I cannot wrap my head around, not even in the slightest. I study history a lot. I study societies a lot. I cannot understand the hatred of another person solely based on some external characteristic, like the color of their skin, or the shade of their hair, or the fact that they speak a different language or my language with a different accent than mine. Substantial reasons for hatred, I don't love them, but I can understand them. But someone who just looks different than me, to hate them just for that, I almost think that it requires some type of, I'm not saying talent in a positive way. Why? What's the reason for it? Viewed from this perspective, anti-Semitism concerns the position of the other in Western society. The other is the creation of non-pluralistic societies, ecclesiastical or secular, and authoritarian regimes. As such, this phenomenon touches upon the collective psychology of a people, transcending religion as well as political and economic principles. Historians have explained the persecution of Iberian Jews in religious, political, and economic terms. The same people who persecuted Jews persecuted the natives of the New World with brutal sadism and infinitely more cruelty. It took only 50 years to reduce the original population of America from 80 million to, anyone know the number after the Spaniards were done with the New World? From 80 million people to 10 million people. Of the 25 million natives inhabiting Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest, only 1 million survived by the year 1600. You understand the millions of people whose lives were brutally taken away from them? Because they were the other, unfortunately. Tatarov, who studied this phenomenon better than anyone else, remarked, quote, that this is a record, not only in relative terms of destruction in the order of 90% or more, but also in absolute terms, since we are talking of the demise of about 70 million human beings. The same people who brought that here were the same people who killed our brothers and sisters in Spain. And you cannot divorce what they did here from what they did there. Yes, different excuses have been given, but it's not true. The Western persecution of the other is alive and well. It has always been. And more often than not, we have found ourselves on the receiving end. I want to read you some parts of this introduction. I'm just afraid to read them on camera. If you wish to understand the civilization in the world that we speak about a lot, our Chachamim are somehow painted as primitive authors of the Talmud, Jews of the East sitting in Babylon, whereas the West, which is very interesting by the way, where East and West actually sits in these terms, the Westerners are cultured, they're civilized, artists, musicians, philosophy, science. It wasn't so long ago also, those were all the words used to describe the Germans, who also showed us their culture and their love. Against people who are primitive and behind in all other ways of problematic. I see a few kids here. I'm going to skip. Maybe I'll just send you the introduction. I ask you to read if you can. Pages 4 and 5. To see a little bit of what the Spaniards did to the Native Americans here. in this country, on this earth, to understand the brutality of the people we're talking about. Maybe a sentence that's neutral. The treatment of Native Americans and Jews reflected the status of aliens in Western tradition. Concerning the alien in antiquity, the great jurist Sir Henry Sumner Maine wrote, quote, "If a man was not of kin to another, there was nothing between them. He was an enemy to be slain or spoiled or hated as much as the wild beasts upon which the tribe made war, as belonging indeed to the craftiest and cruelest order of wild animals. As with Spaniards, the dogs belonging to the clan were superior to aliens. It would scarcely be too strong an assertion that dogs which followed the camp had more in common with it than the tribesmen of an alien and unrelated tribe." When studying Torah, you must study it in the context of history, as I explained at the beginning last week. But even when studying history, you cannot study the history of part of the world and ignore entirely the history of another part of the world, because like that, you will receive a one-dimensional picture, and one-dimensional pictures won't teach you anything. I say this all the time, even in Jewish history. The study of Jewish history from purely a Eurocentric lens, or the opposite, I haven't seen it, but the opposite, only from a Sephardic lens, will cause one to see not just half a picture, but not even a picture, because you can't possibly see the whole picture if you're ignoring half of it. And when we study the next pieces that we're going to study together from this book, In the Shadow of History, the purpose is not to study history. If I wanted to give you a history class, I would change the title of the class from Mishpat Tzedek to History Tzedek. But instead, I wish to prepare us for what we're going to spend the rest of this shiur, as many months and years as it might be, B'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach, to study the Rambam, the laws of the Sanhedrin. A few weeks ago I told you that certain spiritual traditions exist in the Jewish people to cover up for the failures of inept leadership. You remember when I told you that? That sometimes the problems that we face as a people, they are not the problems of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I mean, everything is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, yes? But they're not problems created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're problems created by the Jewish people, more correctly, by Jewish leadership that is inept, that makes wrong decisions. And those wrong decisions lead to catastrophic outcome for the Jewish people. And instead of covering for them, saying, oh, it's all a punishment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, oh, we can't understand what happened, the very least that we can do is to try to understand. Because I know that in the back of everyone's mind in this shiur so far, we've been talking about Sanhedrin, and we're going to learn about a Sanhedrin and about Jewish law, and all we think about is what's actually going to happen to our lives and our freedoms and our liberties the moment there is a Sanhedrin. How terrifying will my life be if the same rabbis that brought me the kosher nostra, the same rabbis that brought me the conversion mafias, the same rabbis that brought me all of the struggles that the Jewish people go through, they're going to be the supreme ayatollahs of the Jewish people? Yonatan Halevi, is that what you're asking for? Is that the pitch that you're making in Mishpat Tzedek? And I think in order to recognize just how powerful a Sanhedrin could be, we must recognize that in our very near history, and not so near history, inept leadership, rabbinic leadership, lay leadership, literally destroyed the Jewish people. And we must be aware of that when having a conversation. That it's not just the law, but it's also the lawmaker. We understand how important it is to have a righteous lawmaker. It would be very wise for us to understand what happens to maybe a good lawmaker who's lacking the integrity and the moral character, the education, the wisdom, the kindness, and compassion that are needed to lead the people forward. And with that, let's open up the book In the Shadow of History. We will be using the end notes in the book, and I added that it's in the back of your PDF. I really will tell you the truth that I really dislike books that have end notes. Because the whole time I have to flip back and forth, back and forth. I wish that people just made footnotes. What's the reason that people don't put footnotes? Sometimes books with footnotes, they scare people. They intimidate them. It's too much going on in a page. So instead they make end notes. In my experience, the people who are afraid of footnotes don't really read books in the first place. And the people who read books are upset at the notes all being in the end. He begins the chapter with a quote from René Girard. Jewish Spain on the eve of the expulsion. From within the system, only differences are perceived. From without, the antagonists all seem alike. From inside, sameness is not visible. From outside, differences cannot be seen. We're going to begin to discuss Jewish Andalusia and Catalonia. And initially I thought I was going to go through these 28, 29 pages all in one shiur. And I feel that if I would do that, it would make those of us who like to study quickly happy, but it would be a disservice to everybody who's part of this Beit Midrash. Because there's so much here in this introduction that needs to be unpacked for us to be able to understand the point of why we're reading it, that I'm going to ask you, we're here together anyways. We have a few weeks till the high holidays start. Let's ride these waves together. Let's journey together, B'ezrat Hashem, wherever HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes us, however long it takes us, that's how long it will take us. I enjoy being here looking at your faces anyway, so Baruch Hashem. Someone talked to me about Jewish Spain. Andalusia versus Catalonia. Anyone know just geography of Spain?
Northern Spain was Christian. What we call it today, Northern Spain, because at that time it wasn't Spain. It was part of the rest of Europe. And southern Spain was Andalus, which was under Muslim rule, and there was huge differences in ideology and approach to Torah.
Very good. So, Matityahu, thank you for sharing that with us. Before I repeat what he said, I was recently listening to an interview on Israeli news. And they were having a conversation about the problems with the Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population in the state of Israel. And it led to a lot of they should do this, we should do that, One of the commentators, which I thought was very wise, says, everybody having this conversation will be unable to find a proper solution to this problem. The reason? You keep using the word they. This is not some pitch for brotherly love here. I'm not pitching brotherly love. You use the word they, like they are some homogenous group, all people who are all the same. You're looking at a group of all you see maybe black jackets, black hats, white shirts, so you don't see anything else there. You don't see the differences between the Hasidim, between the Litayim, between the different thousands groups of Hasidim that are there, the warring factions of the Hasidim, the warring factions of Litayim, the Sephardim who now think that they're Charedim. There's a whole world of subcategories in that term Charedi. And one solution won't fit all of those groups. When looking at anything, my wife wrote an article once for the San Diego Union Tribune. My wife is a very talented writer. I don't ever get a chance to read her writing. Most of it I don't understand because my English is not great enough to understand. But the things that she writes that I am smart enough to understand, she wrote an article in the newspaper here in San Diego regarding the problem of homelessness in San Diego. And everyone has their solutions for homelessness. For some people, let's get them all, throw them out of town. For some people, let's start giving out free houses like candy. For some people, everyone has a different answer for the homeless crisis. And my wife suggested something very radical, which is instead of trying to come up with a solution for homelessness, recognize that not all people are homeless for the same reasons. There are people who are homeless because they are war veterans struggling with PTSD. There are people that are homeless because they're drug addicts, and there are people that are homeless because they were thrown out of mental institutions because their insurance couldn't cover it or whatever. There are people that are homeless because they lost their life and their job and they got everyone has a story. But not all of those people have the same problem. Yeah, they're right now all homeless, that's true. I know there are more political words today than homeless, politically correct words than homeless. I'm using a word. But they're not all the same. And so your plan to give everybody the same treatment and help everybody the same way is actually not going to help anybody. When speaking about Spain and about Sephardim from Spain, it's crucial to understand that the word Sepharad is really a place that is geographically split into two. As Matatiao explained, you have Catalonia, which we're going to call it northern Spain for the sake of this conversation. Northern Spain, which is essentially southern France and Germany. That's what it is. It's that part of Spain, and it's Christian. And you have southern Spain, otherwise known as Andalusia. And Andalusia is going to be a Muslim place where the Chachamim of that place are very, very different than the Chachamim of Catalonia. And if you ever wish to look at the Sephardic rabbis as a homogeneous group of people that all came from Spain, you're going to be surprised, because you'll find that the Chachamim of northern Spain and the Chachamim of southern Spain couldn't be more different. They're almost as similar as the Chachamim of northern Morocco and the Chachamim of southern Germany. There's simply almost nothing in common. And so let's talk about Jewish Andalusia and Catalonia, two forms of religious devotion. This is the eve of the Spanish Inquisition. In a letter written in 1422 by Moses Aragel, the first translator of the Torah into Spanish, to Don Luis de Guzman, gave the following description of Jewish spiritual and intellectual life. Quote, "The Jews of Castile in the past prospered and were the crown and garland of all the Jewish diaspora, and children, wealth, science, and magnanimity. This was in harmony with the nature of the king, his qualities, and the kingdoms under his rule in the glorious and splendid Castile. They linger today as a consequence of the tender age in which they were orphaned. In addition to all the disturbances that they suffered, in the opposite situation we are in anguish and dearth. Our best and wisest children have left us. Nothing remains from our science. And at the riverbed whose waters once carried ships, there cannot be found today even small brooks. Thus our science has vanished." As a consequence of the destruction of the Jewish communities in Moorish Spain in the 12th century by Muslim fanatics from North Africa, who had to run away from Spain because of the Muslim fanatics of Spain? Name me a famous Chacham, his family.
Rambam.
Very good, the Rambam. The Rambam leaves, his family leaves Spain because of persecution. The resulting vacuum was filled by the Jewish communities in Castile. According to Jewish tradition, the great Talmudic Academy of Lucena, the most glorious of the golden age of Sepharad, had been transplanted to Toledo under the direction of the son and nephew of Rabbi Yosef ibn Migas. In modern Israeli cultures, they call him the Migash. Probably they got it from Ashkenazim, but his name is really Ibn Migas. He was one of the teachers of the Rambam. That's exactly right. What? Very good. The father of the Rambam. Very good. Toledo became the cultural center for both Jewish and Christian humanists and scientists, continuing the intellectual tradition of Moorish Spain. From that city came the first translations into Hebrew and Latin of the great monuments of Moorish culture. There, Hebrew and Christian scholars worked hand in hand for the transmission to Christian Europe of the great classics of Islamic philosophical and scientific thought. The Anti-Maimonidean movement, starting in 1180 until 1240, culminating in the famous ban proclaimed in Barcelona on July 26 of 1305, represents a clash between two modes of religious thinking. One, developed in Moorish Spain, and the other in Christendom. The Maimonidean tradition was developed in the pluralistic society of Andalusia. The anti-Maimonidean movement emerged in the authoritarian societies of France and Christian Spain. Let's make something very clear. When we say the word Maimonidean, we're not really referring to the Rambam. Why do I mean that we're not referring to the Rambam? Because we don't believe that the Rambam started the Maimonidean tradition. Rav Saadia Gaon came long before the Rambam, yet we would consider him to be a Maimonidean. But we're using that word because usually the scholars split up the world between the Maimonideans and those who are not Maimonideans. And just if you get confused, how could there be a Maimonidean before the Rambam? It's because we're not actually talking about Maimonides the man, but rather the ideology that is that of the Rambam. Their major conflict pertained to the ultimate ground of religion. For Andalusian Jewry, it was the law. For the anti-Maimonideans, It was zeal and religious fervor. This controversy was analogous but not identical to the conflict between Mitnagdim and Hasidim among Ashkenazim in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's really not the same, but there's similarity to it. If you want to look for similarities, you can find it. In Andalusia, the study of Torah was the study of the law. What does the Torah say? What does halakha demand? How do we serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in accordance with the law? In northern Spain, the whole style of religion was one of zeal and religious fervor. When he begins to describe for us later first-hand accounts of what a religion that is governed by zeal looks like, you might actually begin to understand that this war is long from over and you and I live in this reality every single day of our life. In the next section, Chacham Faur is going to paraphrase what we already learned before, the meaning of the word avodah zarah. There is avodah, service of the Creator, the way that the law demands for the Creator to be worshipped, through the Berit. What is the Berit? The Berit is a bilateral covenant between us and God, in which both of us share our expectations and our demands, and both of us fulfill what we promise the other. Someone who serves God not through the Berit is therefore someone who's Oved Avodah Zarah, who serves, maybe God, sure, but in a foreign way. And that foreign way is outside of the law and therefore not permitted to us. On page 11, the religious systems and ideals of Andalusian Jewry found their highest expression in the writings of Maimonides, the Rambam. The precise perimeters and legal definitions of the law were formulated in the Mishneh Torah, the first and last code comprising the entire Jewish legal system. That's true. The Shulchan Aruch does not cover the entire Jewish legal system. It only covers what a Jew needs in Galut. But the Rambam is the only author of a halachic work, listen very carefully, to ever give us all of Jewish law on a silver platter from A to Z. The Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides' classic work on Jewish esoteric thinking, traces the perimeter of the purely personal and individualistic aspects of human relations with God. From the perspective of the Andalusian tradition, the anti-Maimonidean movement sweeping European Jewry represented Christian thought patterns and feelings. He mentioned in that paragraph the meaning of the word ijtihad, in the form of pious impulse and religious zeal, rather than precise legal definitions of the law, is the determining factor of this type of devotion. Again, from this perspective, the anti-Maimonideans were repudiating the tradition and values of Old Sefarad and deauthorizing the law, otherwise the Mishneh Torah. The roots of the Maimonidean controversy will become evident upon examining the anti-rationalistic movements ravaging Christendom at the time. If you look with me at footnote 16, in the back. The war between northern Spain and southern Spain concerning religion had to do with how much of your personal devotion, how much of your own religion can you make up before it doesn't stay part of the Jewish faith. We live in a Jewish community that has many things that it made up. And when you start to question those things, well, why is that the way that you're choosing to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Why are you taking Jewish people's dollars and using them for that when that's not something the Jewish people need? Then you must ask yourself a question. Is it the law that governs our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu or our feelings? And if it's our feelings, then I guess everything can be included in the worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This has to do with the concept of heroism. Look in footnote 16. This is why Judaism excludes heroism, the highest form of personal endeavor. Accordingly, Rambam classified heroism as a vice, not a virtue. Therefore, although martyrdom is commendable under the circumstances prescribed by halakha, can you give me an example when halakha requires one to give up their life?
If you're required to murder somebody to commit acts of sexual immorality against somebody, or commit the, what is that?
Very good. So according to the Torah, we give up our life for 3 mitzvot. There are some other things, other scenarios, but the mitzvot that we can talk about. If someone says, I'll kill you if you don't kill that person, we don't kill that person. We don't have the right to kill that person, and therefore, if we were to lose our life there, that is a martyrdom that is welcomed. It's commendable under the circumstances prescribed by the law. It is equally sinful when the law does not require it. See Mishnah Torah. When you begin to read the literature coming out of Christian Jewish communities, Sephardic and Ashkenazi, one thing you begin to see is the value that is placed on Jewish martyrs. Martyrs not always for the right reasons. For noble religious reasons, yes. For reasons that halakha requires, no. In fact, in the Ashkenazi Siddur, right before Musaf, there's a prayer that said on behalf of the martyrs. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Very good, Av Rachamim, yeah? The whole part of the tefillah that is about the communities that were massacred and were slaughtered. Now, listen, there were communities that were killed. No one is taking that away. It's a very interesting thing to begin looking at when Jews started instituting prayers for martyrs in our Siddur. It begins to happen, if you want a hint, it begins to happen when the Christians begin to institute prayers for martyrs in their Siddur, particularly in the Crusades. In the Crusades, how are you going to convince people to go across the world? And okay, you convince them by telling them you could loot people, steal, rape, murder, pillage, whatever you want. But the families, you comfort them by, if your child, your husband, your brother dies as a martyr, we'll remember them in the church. They'll be on memorial plaques. That's exactly when the Jewish people started doing these things too. It's also uncanny, by the way, the memorial prayers the Jewish community says, and the memorial prayers that the Christians say are almost identical to each other. The Sephardic one that is said is almost copy and paste that of the Catholic one, minus the name of Jesus. Something to think about. The place of fervor in religious thinking was the focus of a dispute between the Rambam and an anonymous rabbi urging North African Jews to martyrdom rather than to confess Muhammad's mission. In one of his arguments, the rabbi contended that since Christians, quote, rather die than confess Muhammad's mission, those Jews should also choose martyrdom. Obviously, he did not intend to set up Christianity as a paradigm for Judaism, but only to encourage the Jews to emulate this type of religious fervor. Reflecting Halevi's position, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that jihad and Christianity are synonymous, the Rambam retorted, is it that there is no God in Israel that we have to learn about our faith from Muslims and Christians? We do not have a halakha of our own. Why do we have to emulate the religious fervor of Christians in order to be good Jews? If one were to accept the notion that pious fervor is a true expression of religion, then, quote, we would have to burn ourselves and our children in the service of God, as heathens in biblical times did. I mean, what greater sacrifice is there than killing oneself for God? Than killing one's child for God? You're familiar with Gay Ben Hinnom? Right outside of Yerushalayim, the old city of Yerushalayim, there's a valley. That valley was a guy, it was a valley, that's the word for it. And the priest that ran the Avodah Zarah there, his name was Ben Hinnom, and he had this huge copper statue with its palms outstretched. And the priests of this Avodah Zarah would burn fire underneath that statue. And then they would take their babies and sacrifice their babies by placing them in the outstretched palms of this idol, and the babies would burn to death. What greater religious fervor is there than that? Imagine how commendable it would be for Jewish people to kill their children in the name of God. There's nothing...
Directly against...
Yes?
That goes directly against this past week's parsha.
It
says specifically, like, not to sacrifice our children like they do.
Meaning, what is the warning that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving us? Don't think that that is an act of religious fervor that I want. If I want something, I'll tell you. I don't want you to go so far that that's what you're going to do to your children. That may be an act of personal endeavor and piety, but it's not an act that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would welcome. In fact, it would be the sin of murder. Rambam concluded that the rabbi concurred with the view of Christianity rather than with the Torah. And I highly recommend you read the Rambam's Igeret HaShemad, which is the letter that this source comes from. There's a word for it in English. They call it maybe it's a letter on martyrdom. It could be that's what they call it. But you can find an English copy of that somewhere. Page 11 at the bottom of the page. Jewish anti-rationalism and semantic assimilation. Aristotelian rationalism and speculative theology reached France from Muslim Spain. It provoked strong opposition. The roots of anti-rationalism were deeply entrenched in the institutional values of France. And even though there were some men of stature who favored this type of speculation, it generated strong opposition at the end of the 12th century and throughout the 13th century. I don't actually know how to pronounce Bernard of Clairvaux, someone here speak French, who has rightly been described as the great detective of heresy, best exemplifies the orthodox position. Essentially, he opposed rationalism. And there were different levels of opposition to rationalism. Some only opposed the philosophical side, some opposed all of it. Not all of it was the same, but ultimately there were those that opposed rational thinking. Within the context of time, the Maimonidean controversy in the opposition to rationalistic theology represented a Jewish absorption of Christian thought patterns. To Jews in Christian society, the appeal of this ideology rested in the fact that they could voice their religion through the pathos and ideals of the host culture. Jews are always trying to fit in. And if my religion becomes like your religion, then maybe we can be friends. How often do you hear American Jews obsessed with the term Judeo-Christianity? I hear this thrown around all the time. We are Judeo-Christians. I don't know what it means to be a Judeo-Christian. I mean, maybe it's the closest, like you go to the bakery and they have black and white cookies. So it's half black and it's half white. But you couldn't possibly have a cookie that is both black and white and it would somehow, they would seamlessly intersperse with each other. It couldn't happen. It's not the way that it works. There are Jews and there are Christians, and there's nothing in common between those two faiths. And the desire to become Judeo-Christians is part of our desire to explain our religion in the terms and the words and the logic of our host cultures. The most important mind to emerge from Christian Spain and champion of the new form of Jewish orthodoxy was the saintly Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. I must make a disclaimer here. Yesterday on my YouTube channel, there was a lady who reached out, very upset. I had said something in which I disagreed with the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. And as a Lubavitcher, she was visibly upset. And I told her that as a Lubavitcher, I highly doubt that she would be able to accept anyone disagreeing with her hero. In our tradition, all Chachamim are able to be argued with. We respect everyone. We don't have to accept everything that everyone did or said or wrote. And just because we don't accept something that somebody wrote or said or did, doesn't mean that we don't respect them. It doesn't mean that we don't consider them people that are worthy of respect. It just means I don't accept everything you said or did. In the realm of today's cancel culture, it's really easy to just wipe somebody out for something that they did wrong or something they said that I didn't like. But our Chachamim didn't usually operate like that. Chacham Faur is going to say some things that might sound harsh against a number of Chachamim. And I'm not here to tell you that I wish to speak poorly of Chachamim. But it's okay for us to analyze, honestly, and critique things that we don't agree with that Chachamim wrote. You do it all the time. When you read the weekly parasha, and you read through different commentaries, and you choose one over the other one, does that mean that you disrespect or hate the other one? It just means that you chose one commentary, sat better with you, was able to sit with your logic, you were able to explain it properly, to get behind it, and that's the commentary you chose. It doesn't mean you hate the other one. There's a certain, I see in the Jewish community even, because Rashi has been so overquoted and overused as the commentary of the Torah, there's been this like movement to undermine Rashi. We hate Rashi, we don't want to read Rashi, we don't like his commentary of the Torah. It's almost like hate. Same thing with Midrashim, you find it. I find it also even with rabbis like the Mishnah Berurah. Somehow it became in vogue in the Jewish community. We hate the Mishnah Berurah, we don't read Shulchan Aruch Mishnah Berurah. I want to buy a set of books that I want to hear it quote the Mishnah Berurah. I don't understand where this idea of let me just hate everybody that I don't like or I don't agree with comes from. It's important to read from everyone, and whatever you don't like, you don't have to quote. You don't have to approve of. You can say, I don't approve. I visited once Mori Arav Yaakov Peretz, and I cannot tell you the name of the book because I don't want to hurt him, but I will tell you. I went to his house, and I saw a book of Chassidut on his shelf. I took down a book of Chassidut. I was surprised he had it. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised that it was so prominently displayed there. And when I opened it, I saw that in one of the pages he had crossed out an entire paragraph. And next to it, he wrote in Hebrew, Lo nachon, exclamation mark. It's not correct. This is wrong. And I recognized at that point, you could read everybody's books. You can study from everyone. You're also reserved the right in the margin to say, I don't agree with what's written here. I'm not beholden to you because I read your book. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, otherwise known as the Ramban. So if you have the Ramban.
Pause here for a second.
Yeah.
At some point when this video goes live, we'll have to go back and edit that into a clip. I think it's an important message for people to hear.
Okay, if you find it and you tell me the start time and end time, we'll make it into a clip.
We'll make it into a clip.
But you have the flip side. The flip side is sometimes you quote someone that you're not behind their whole agenda, but because you quoted them, then you become vilified because it must be that if you quoted them, you agree with everything they said. The world is very black and white and it's very juvenile. It's not the way in which our Chachamim operated or thought. So if you have the Rambam on one hand, probably the person you could choose on the complete opposite side is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. They have names that are very similar. The Rambam with an M at the end, and the Ramban with an N at the end. He was the greatest advocate of mysticism and one of the most intelligent censors of philosophical speculation. First, and he makes quite an accusation here, he no longer recognized halakha or the Torah as the sole constitutive of humankind's relation with God. Where does that come from? Have you ever heard the phrase, Naval Birshut HaTorah? Have you heard anyone say this before?
Yes, it's when someone does something that's not technically a biblical prohibition, but is not necessarily it's morally gray. Like, I think a classic example that
Wait, don't give a classic example. Don't give me a classic example.
No classic examples.
I don't want to hear it. No. I wanted to answer. You answered it. You did good. So what does it say here? Naval B'Shut Torah means that a person could be bad even though they follow the law. Or that, there's another phrase, Kadesh et atzmecha b'ma shemutar lecha. Make yourself holy by abstaining from the things that are actually permissible. Have you heard of that phrase before? These are phrases that come to us from the camp of the Ramban. And as beautiful as they might seem, or as nice as someone may have used them in a derasha, or Binyamin Simcha would give you an example or two or three of them, all of those ideas tell me the law doesn't actually matter. Because if I can still be bad if I follow the law, it tells me there's something else aside from halakha that is important. And that's a very dangerous thing to say. Or that things that are permitted by halakha are still bad. How could it be bad? If our Creator told us it's okay, how could I possibly be holier by not doing things that I'm allowed to do? This whole idea is one that is very prevalent in the Jewish community that you and I are a part of. But it's very dangerous. It should be noted. Let's see where I'll go to the next part. So it's very obvious to you then that the Ramban would not agree with the Rambam's understanding of Avodah Zarah. Because if Avodah Zarah means to serve God only as prescribed in the law, then the Ramban says, well listen, the law is not the only thing. And therefore not all things are Avodah Zarah if they're a deviation from the Berit, and that's going to lead us down a wonderful rabbit hole. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman was not just a criticizer of everything that came from Andalusia in terms of rational Jewish thinking, he also was a very big believer in, let's look on page 13, in the science of necromancy, or chokhmata negomancia, that is black magic. In fact, he dismisses certain things that are rational arguments based on evidence that we have using magic. If you look in footnote 28, the Ramban was in close personal contact with sorcerers who were, quote, masters of demons, and had instructed him. See Torah Tamimah. His main opposition to Aristotle, quote, may his name be blotted out, is that he denies many things witnessed by many, and we also witness their truth, and are well known in the world, like the subject of demons, witchcraft, and the classes of incense for the heavenly forces. Aristotle was the first one to deny spiritism and say that the subject of demons and the actions of witchcraft are nothing. Now, this is going to be a major point of contention between Chachamei Andalusia and Chachamei Catalonia. It doesn't matter so much to me whether you believe in demons or not, what you understand with the passage of the Talmud, but to understand that between the Rambam and the Ramban, very often rational things could be pushed aside based on experiences with these type of things, like black magic. Look at the last two sentences on page 13. Referring to the Rambam, who maintained that sorcery and witchcraft are lies and falsehood. That's what the Rambam writes in Mishneh Torah, Avodah Zarah, chapter 11, Halakha 16. The Rambam says it's what are witchcraft and sorcery? It's nothing. It's fake. What do you have to worry about it for? He writes, those who pretend to be wise and emulate the Greek, that's what he says. On page 14, this would be known with spirits through the science of necromancy. And it also could be known to the minds through the clues of the Torah, to those who understand their secrets. And I cannot explain further, because we would have to shut up the mouth of those who pretend to be wise about nature, emulating the Greek Aristotle, who rejected everything that he cannot perceive with the senses, and haughtily he and his evil disciples thought that everything that he did not grasp with his reason is untrue. There is Jewish opposition to rationalist thinking. And that Jewish opposition, we argue, doesn't come necessarily from inside of the Jewish tradition. But it comes very likely from outside of the Jewish tradition, from the spirit of anti-rationalist Christian thought that was going on at the time, and Jews who jumped on that bandwagon of religious fervor versus a logical tradition that was given to us by our Chachamim in the likes of the Rambam and those who were part of that camp. There are some examples given here that might be very scary for you to read. You might want to read them, but on your own time. You should know that a lot of the thinking that came out of Catalonia and out of the mystical circles of the Jewish community were used, and some are still used today, to prove things like the validity of the Trinity, certain Christian doctrines. You could find a lot of source, not intended to by these rabbis, but much that can support certain Christian ideas. If you look at the bottom of page 15, the three authorities just mentioned were saintly figures and above suspicion. Listen to what Rabbi Faur tells you. He's telling you certain thinkers who fought against the Rambam's thought. Certain thinkers that introduce ideas that are dangerous. They go against what Rabbi Yehuda Levi taught. Certain thinkers that introduce ideas that could support Christian faith among the Jewish people, chas v'shalom. But he still tells you they were saintly figures and above suspicion. I believe wholeheartedly that Chacham Faur felt this way. It's very normal as a Sephardic Chacham to be able to write very harsh things about another Chacham and yet to still respect them and to still give them the type of... For a man who didn't believe in the authenticity of the Zohar and Kabbalah and the like, Chacham Faur quotes a tremendous amount of Kabbalists throughout his writings with a lot of respect. That's the hallmark of a true Talmid Chacham. Nonetheless, whatever theological subtleties they intended, their doctrines appear to confirm within the semantic context of Christian society that something other than God could be the object of worship. How many times do people tell you, it's not Hashem, but that was the Satan who did that? There's now a Satan who does things opposite from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? People are worried, they're tripping over themselves. This is the Satan, that is the Satan. What is going on with the Satan? A few years ago, there was a terrible tragedy in Israel. I'm not piggybacking on that tragedy. In Meron, by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's grave. And one rabbi wrote an article after that saying, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was mad at us and that's why he caused this to happen. Is there a God up there in heaven that is called Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? That is now going to kill Jewish people because of him? This notion appeared to further promote by those mystical circles that directed their prayers not to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but to some type of Sefirot. And as one Maimonidean noted, whereas the Christians believe in the Trinity, the mystics believe in 10, the Sefirot. Now obviously the mystics have a response to this. I'm reading to you though from someone who's not a mystic. Concerned with the possible misinterpretation of these mystical doctrines, Rabbi Nisim Girondi, one of the most illustrious Talmudists of that period, and a great admirer of the Ramban, confided to one of his disciples that the Ramban became very excessively committed to believing in the topics of that mysticism. And so here we've set the stage. What is going on in the Christian world at that time is that the rationalist thought that was introduced to society and was so embraced by certain elements of society was so attacked by others. What ends up happening is the Jewish community begins to emulate that as well. And they begin to embody the rationalist versus anti-rationalist wars that were going on in the Christian world around them. Among our Chachamim, that seemed to have been a divide between northern Spain and southern Spain, between Catalonia and Andalusia. The Chachamim of Catalonia introduced a very specific way of teaching, of commenting on the Torah, of theology that was so foreign to the Chachamim of Andalusia, who believed wholeheartedly that the Torah that they were teaching was that which was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu and Har Sinai in the Talmud of our Chachamim. I usually don't go over my time, but I don't want to stop here. Would you be okay with me if I read one more chapter with you? Yeah, if anyone needs to go, you can. I don't want to stop right here. That's not where I plan to stop.
Sure.
Let's talk about Toledo. In Toledo in Spain is the first place that we find criticism against the Rambam. And if we wish to understand why there was criticism against the Rambam, I really answered this question 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Monday night, I spoke about the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam and other such things. In that shiur, I gave you an answer, but let's read it together. The earliest criticism against the Rambam in Spain came from Toledo by a Chacham by the name of Rabbi Meir Abulafia, one of the spiritual leaders of the community. His opposition to the Rambam was not ideological. This is very important. You might not like what it was, but it wasn't ideological. As we learn from Sheshet Hanasi, Rabbi Abulafia was moved by personal and professional reasons. Which personal and professional reasons? You see, previously, and there was a period in our history where things changed. When the rabbis would teach the people halakha, they would never explain the reasons for why they ruled what they ruled. Have any of you ever asked a rabbi a question in which you try to push back a little bit on the answer, and what do they tell you? Has it ever happened to you?
Yeah, sometimes they don't like it when you ask them why.
There's no obligation to explain the why. Why not?
That's just the way it is.
That's just the way it is. Deal with it. That's what I said. That's what the rabbi said. That's what the posek said. That's what the gadol hador said. That's what whoever phrase it's going to be, and you don't question it. Previously, rabbis in Toledo had refused to teach the Talmud, or even the halachot, to the community. So no one except for the clergy had access to the legal sources of halakha. With the publication of the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, the general public, for the first time in history, had direct access to a code of law. What is the problem with that? The next sentence is the problem with that. Fearing that their authority would be challenged, the rabbinic clergy attacked it. The Rambam, what crime did he commit? He committed the crime of giving the people access to halakha. What do you mean? If they have access to halakha, they're going to challenge our authority. And if they challenge our authority, that'll be the end of us. As is clear from the testimony of Sheshet HaNasi, Rabbi Abulafia and a circle of colleagues were deeply concerned about the challenge that such a work could make to their authority. And referring to Rabbi Meir Abulafia, Sheshet HaNasi wrote, this is a direct quote, read his letter. When I was in Castile after the Mishneh Torah had reached them, I heard one of the judges, I do not want to mention his name, mumble, what does this person know that we don't already know? The Rambam. And since in this code he does not bring proofs from the words of the Talmudic sages, who would heed him? Look at footnote 41, if you can. On footnote 41, it's very important when a judge issues a ruling to explain why that ruling was done. There was a time, since Yehudai Gaon, the head of the Academy at Sura, that codes of Jewish law don't cite their sources. If you want to talk about that later, we can. But for right now, it's very interesting that the rabbis that attack the Rambam for not citing sources, when they themselves, I'm thinking most famously of the Ravad. The Ravad, who critiques the Rambam for not citing sources, is most famous that when he wrote a book of halakha, he didn't cite his sources either. It is much better to study the Talmud and Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi's halachot. Why should we bother with his books and words? This is the Rambam. And I countered him together with his mentors and showed him his fault. And never again did he speak about it in my presence, and since that moment I knew his beliefs and ideas. And behold, it came upon him what he feared most, from the book of Eov. Because before the Mishneh Torah had arrived in the lands of Castile, the study of the halachot, not to mention the Talmud, was unknown to the people. And that judge would render judgments on his own, according to his whim. Want to exercise something? Try calling a kashrut organization and ask them why they removed their certification from a product. Or ask them why they labeled the pareve product dairy. Or ask them a question. Ask them why they don't. You enter the blank. And see the kind of answer you're going to get.
I already did that with Uncrustables.
Very good. All the power is in their hands. And they have no need to tell you why. And nobody could challenge him because they did not know what the law was. And all were dependent on that judge, that posek. And when the people saw the 14 sections of the Mishneh Torah, and it was examined by those knowing Hebrew, and they began to appreciate its beauty and the arrangement of the mitzvot, and the ethics and sciences included in the book of knowledge, their eyes opened, and all were determined to make copies for themselves. And it was much praised and loved. A book came to Spain, and the people who understood it fell in love with it. For the first time, they had access to halakha in a clear way, in an intelligent way. Everything spelled out properly. Old and young, whoever could read, got together to study its laws and understand its judgments. Page 17. And behold, today there are many who understand its words. Therefore, when there is a litigation between two parties and the judge pronounces a verdict, they examine its words of the Mishneh Torah. Upon seeing this, the above-mentioned judges, of whom this conceited idiot, that's what he writes about him, speaking arrogantly, is one of them. Their envy grew and their anger kindled and tried to allure those who supported the law of Moshe, the light of the West, beaming light upon all of Israel, to depart from their right path. They are now further sinning, telling the ignoramuses slander about Maimonides, like what that idiot had written in his book. And many more things were later added to the slander in order that they should obey him and not depart from his words. So the opposition to the Rambam's writings was not because of what he wrote in the Moreh Nevuchim. It was not because of things that he believed philosophically. The thing that bothered the rabbis in Spain the most about the writings of the Rambam was that it freed the people. It freed the people from their tyranny. It freed the people from their rule that was unchallenged, unquestioned, couldn't even be challenged, because they refused to teach the people the things that they needed to know. I once saw a quote, "Nobody will give you the education you need to overthrow them." That's the way the world works. David HaMelech tells his son Shlomo, "Im chacham libecha beni, yismach libi gam ani." If your heart is wise, my son, I will also be wise. A great teacher is one that is not jealous of their students' accomplishments. A great teacher, sometimes you taught mathematics in 4th grade and 5th grade, and you made a student fall in love with mathematics, and they went on to the university, and then they became a professor of mathematics. And then they come to visit you. You're not upset at them because you're just a 4th grade teacher, and now they're a professor of mathematics at Harvard and MIT. You're so proud of them. But jealous, petty teachers, they limit the information that you can be exposed to. Because the worst thing that could ever happen to them is if you know more than them, or if you can challenge them, or if you can question them. I had a brother who was very intelligent, he's still very intelligent. He was very good in math. And in elementary school, his math teacher kept throwing him out of the class because she would make mistakes in her math work, and he would correct them. And her attitude was, I'm the math teacher, how can you? You're a little kid, you're not supposed to know that. And when they went to complain to the principal, of course, my brother was the one who got in trouble. It's not just in Torah that way. There are small people, petty people, and they're afraid you're going to take away their job. So basically, Rabbi Abulafia was an honorable, decent man. What do you mean honorable, decent? He was just worried about his job. He didn't hate the Rambam. He hated that what it was doing to the people. As Sheshet said, his motivations were personal, not ideological. He had written his criticism in his youth, and probably, as Sheshet hinted, he had been prodded, quote, by his mentors, older members of the rabbinic establishment. But listen to something beautiful. As he matured, Rabbi Meir Abulafia realized his error. In 1204, when he received the news of the Rambam's death, he recanted his criticism. In what amounted to a public apology, he wrote an elegy lamenting the passing of the great master. It's a very famous hesped that he gave over the Rambam. And historians are busy scratching their heads trying to understand what happened from yesterday till today, that he went from criticizing the Rambam to supporting the Rambam. The footnotes here of Chacham Faur are quite enlightening in this regard. If you look at footnote 45. He used such expressions as, cry for the prince of ethics who has been removed. He was as the soul, and we the body. Concerning the Mishneh Torah, he exclaimed, awake, look at the sages of the time, beating together like beggars on the door of your learning, Rambam. He also made reference to Rambam's famous philosophical work, quote, in the guide for the perplexed, the swords of the minds that are in the darkness glow like lightning flashes. And quote, in its words, those who went astray learn intelligence, and those who are idle in the fear of their maker gain strength. Referring to the public who used his book to protect itself from unscrupulous clergy, he said, to whom shall they now run for help? And upon whom could they now rely after you? They will never remove from themselves the yoke of your mourning. Rambam, now that you're gone, who is going to free the Jewish people from the hands of tyrannical rabbis? He was contrite and begged for forgiveness. If like a sparrow I could fly into his grave, my eyes would summon tears, I would irrigate with my tears his dust as the streams of his writings had irrigated my heart. And he concluded, peace shall hover over your flesh, as in yourself, peace and justice had always embraced. You want to know the definition of teshuvah? That's the definition of teshuvah. To admit publicly your error about a man so great. Maybe you can't turn back the tide of what you wrote many years ago. But as close to this, the circles that prodded the young Rabbi Abulafia, they persisted in their opposition. No more than his brother Yosef. His brother Yosef was the one who caused the famous Rabbi David Kimchi to lose his job. He writes Kamchi here. Could be that's the way to pronounce it. Anyone heard of the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi? He wrote a commentary on
the Nevi'im and Ketuvim.
Very good. He had come to Toledo and got rid of the Radak from his job to get together. He got together all the anti-Maimonideans. He got them thrown out. The new religious ideology was sweeping from the north, soon found home in Castile. About the year 1240, the saintly Rabbi Yonah Girondi was invited to Toledo. He was an outstanding preacher and a staunch spokesman for the new religious ideology. In his youth, he had been one of the main instigators for the ban against the Rambam and the burning of the Moreh Nevuchim in Montpellier in December of 1232. According to some of his contemporaries, he was one of those denouncing the guide to the ecclesiastical authorities. In his zeal for the new ideology, he did not shrink from informing the church on another Jew. He remained in Toledo until his death, preaching and instilling in the new generation the values and ethical principles of the new ideology. There are Jewish legends that he did teshuvah at the end of his life. I'm not here to talk about that. Less than 50 years after his death in 1305, the year in which the ban against the Maimonideans was pronounced in Barcelona, the anti-Maimonidean forces achieved an overwhelming and conclusive victory. But at this point in Spain, everything nosedives. What was the victory? Rabbeinu Asher was installed as the spiritual leader of the community in Toledo. So who was appointed as the chief rabbi of this capital of Judaism in Spain? The most distinguished legal mind to emerge from medieval Germany and a strong opponent of the Andalusian school. Why would you import a German rabbi to be the rabbi of a Spanish community? But this was a victory against the Maimonideans, appointing Rabbeinu Asher as the leader of Spanish Jewry at that time. His ministry determined once and for all the future development of Iberian history for both Jews and Christians. In spite of the clergy's attempt to protect their interests, Toledo had been the heir of Andalusian intellectual tradition and the leader of Jewish humanism and rationalism in Christian Spain. The installation of Rabbeinu Asher marked the end of this tradition. He strongly opposed secular studies and speculative thought. If you wish to begin to understand why certain Orthodox Jewish communities so oppose secular studies, working, you can trace it back very, very, very far. It's not a modern invention. And worked tirelessly to undermine the cultural legacy shared by Muslims, Jews, and Christians during the golden age of Sepharad. In particular, he was the sworn foe of those scholars and thinkers who represented the educational values and traditions of old Sepharad. Convinced that he was the only representative of God and the law of Moses, he was authoritarian and doctrinaire, tolerating little dissent, even from respected colleagues. Differing with him was an act of apostasy. If you don't believe it, you can look it up himself in his own writing, Sheldu Tshuvot HaRosh, 55:9. Rabbeinu Asher believed that people did not have the right to argue with him. You know how far the authority of the Rosh went? I'll tell you in just a moment. Remind me to answer that question. He dismissed the judicial authorities preceding him in Toledo. So he fires the leadership on the grounds that these Dayanim acted, quote, by the authority of the king. That is, they lacked divine authority and legitimacy as he did. The testimony of the community's notaries and scribes he regarded as suspect, since they do their work to increase their profit, alluding to the rabbinic authorities of Andalusia who maintained that it was possible to combine the study of Torah with philosophy. He declared that whoever had studied science and philosophy, we're reading now directly from the Rosh, would never be able to escape from it and to bring into his heart the science of the law of the Torah, because he would not be able to recant from the natural science to which he was accustomed, because his heart will always be attracted to it. Therefore, he would never be able to grasp the wisdom of the Torah, which are the paths of life, because his heart will always be with the science of nature, and he would want to compare these two sciences and to bring proofs from one to the other, and consequently, he would twist the halakha because they are mutually exclusive and are not compatible with one another. From the world that gave us the Rambam, that gave us the Rif, that gave us Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, our rabbinic leadership was transferred into the hands of a Chacham who came to us from Germany and believed wholeheartedly that one who had corrupted his mind with a study of the sciences, with philosophy, with rational and speculative thought, was never going to be able to comprehend the Torah properly. And just like that, the impact of his ministry on the educated public of Sepharad could hardly be overstated. Next week, we're going to talk about what that impact looked like. What does it mean for us? I don't wish to vilify Rabbeinu Asher. Maybe I should invite Rabbi Yosef Zarnigian to give a class. Rabbi Yosef Zarnigian, although a great fan of Chacham Faur in his writings, has a defense of the Rosh, of Rabbeinu Asher. The reasoning behind the way he operated his rabbinic establishment. Obviously, Chacham Faur didn't agree. But maybe we'll ask him to write something. I'll reach out to him when I get a chance, if someone can remind me. But for right now, what is important? Perhaps you might begin to see the influence of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, in Spain, when you see that when Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writes his Shulchan Aruch, he chooses to bring the three major halachic opinions together. That of the Rambam, which we see was the leader of Spain. That of the Rif, Rabbi Yitzhak al-Fasi from Fez, who we see was studied in Spain. And that of who's the third pillar of Maran's halacha? The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. Now, if you're a Maimonidean, introducing the Rosh's writings in halacha alongside that of the Rambam and the Rif is a sellout to Sephardic tradition. This is somebody who doesn't understand that there's a difference, worlds apart between these two schools of thought. And certainly, as somebody once accused me of, that I am a post-expulsion Sephardi. I have a post-Girush disorder. He said about me. Why? Because it's true. I'm a student of Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch. Perhaps on the other side was the understanding that Maran had. That once Spain had been divided in two, we could continue to try and fight, stand on our ideology, and separate further and further. Or we could do our best to bring all of those camps together, and at least in the realm of halakha, possibly not in the realm of understanding of the world. But at least in the realm of halakha, Maran, we say, tried to bring the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim together. But primarily, Maran was born into a Sephardic community that was torn down the middle. And his dream after the Sanhedrin was at the very least to give the world a Shulchan Aruch, to create a world in which we could all unite around one book, even if it meant incorporating opinions that otherwise were considered outside of the camp of Sephardic halakha. One could argue that that was a positive endeavor. One could argue the opposite. I think you know where I stand here. But everything that we study today explains very clearly what's the next step. And that is, how did the world of the Rambam, the world of the Rif, the world of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, how did it end up with the world of Spanish expulsion? Becoming very similar to the orthodoxy found in France and Germany and then Catalonia. At least historically we've seen that there was a major war, an effort to make that happen. And then ultimately the final blow was the transfer of power of Sephardic leadership from Spanish Jewry to German Jewry. And B'ezrat Hashem, next week we're going to discuss the rest of it. I recommend you read the rest of the chapter, so next week's shiur is not a surprise to you. We're going to go through the details of that. I ask you right now, please, like I said at the beginning, we're not canceling Rabbeinu Asher. As upset as you might be, and as bothered as you might be by the anti-Maimonideans who wage a war against the Rambam, remember, Cheva, it didn't happen yesterday. It didn't happen 2 days ago. We're many, many, many hundreds of years after that. Sure, we are suffering from a lot of the symptoms of that war. Baruch Hashem, we've had Chachamim since then who've taught us what is the right way to bridge those divides, to bridge those gaps, to narrow them, at the very least, if I can bridge them, to bring them closer to each other. We at Shiviti are from the Bet Midrash of those rabbis who tried their best, if not to reconciliate, then at least to remedy as much as possible the warring factions that exist in Am Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bless us with siyata d'shmaya, that we should study the things that we study. Don't get too worked up about them. B'ezrat Hashem, next week we'll do the second half of this and return back to the introduction of the Rambam, to laws of Sanhedrin, and everything else we plan to study together. For now, thank you so much for learning Torah with me. If anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to stick around. For those of you who need to go, please go, and forgive me for staying over my time. But B'ezrat Hashem, we will continue together next week on Monday night. Kol Tov.